Those that couldn't be here. So, and for recording, just know we put them on our YouTube page. We don't to CNN or anything like that. Don't worry. They're not aired before the Bears game. You're fine. So anyway, Stephanie Spellers is just a real public face for the National Episcopal Church, even if you've probably never heard of her or seen her before, and this is your first entree in. And then a couple of you have probably already been doing this book in EFM or have done it before, of course, EFM. All right, all my spiel is now over. Somebody must have some kind of overarching thoughts so far of what they've read. Who wants to start? Dun, dun, dun.
All right, I will.
All right.
I was waiting. So in the introduction, she says, basically, she says, the purpose of this book is to examine your life and the life of your church and its systems and assumptions. And when I read that, I thought, well, that's awesome. We don't need to do that because we're, so open and available and we think these things and etc. Except she also said that after the cracking, when you read the introduction, she tells you what each of the chapters is. Do we go back to the center? And I immediately thought of not just the initial months of COVID, but the first year of COVID and all the social justice issues and all the political things that just all were happening at the exact same time. And I'm afraid that now that we're back in person, which has been a while, but I'm afraid we're just recentering on what we had before, which was awesome. But this book, I am excited because she said she's going to give us steps as a community to become more the community of love. I believe that it will give us some things to do to examine where can we go from here as opposed to just recentering.
Fabulous. Other thoughts or reactions?
My immediate thought, and just kind of an overarching thing, was that it's kind of a prophetic voice. She points out some of the errors or sins of the church. She talks about decline and then kind of reform, or a reimagined church. So to me, it almost is like a prophet, a modern day prophet.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The meaning of prophetic teaching and preaching. Yeah.
Well, I think she was also talking about how there was just such a convergence of disasters that came upon us all at the same time, that the cracking was more intense than it's ever been before. And she's hoping, and it kind of exposed us all for kind of the Pharisees that we are, that she's hoping that because of the huge fracturing that has occurred, that we will all become more aware that we need to do something different. We can't just go on as status quo like we've done in the past after little fissures and cracks have occurred.
Right. Especially when, as Carolyn is, I think, rightly saying, we run the risk of falling back into the trappings of things pre-COVID and you almost want to say pre-2020, because it was really that year when, in those few months, which she lays out well, that, it wasn't just COVID, it was also the racial tensions spurred by primarily the death of George Floyd, but then opened up the death of Breonna Taylor, and we became more aware of all these other things.
And now with all the global warming disasters that are occurring more and more and more frequently, I don't remember in my life how these are happening. They can't say this is a once in 100-year thing that's happening, because it's not anymore.
Right.
It's common. So But I think she was like in the past, it's like our faith is like muscle memory where, oh, this made us feel good and it was okay before this happened. So we'll just go back to that.
Right.
Because
right.
that's not working anymore.
Right.
There was something about how you, I don't know if she said it or if it was just, it was like how our institutions put themselves back together after they've cracked, but then how you put yourself back together, because we all broke too individually. And I mean,
I know I
did.
Yeah.
I don't know if this speaker, but and it's like when there's that thing like people send it to me all the time. There's a Japanese word for when they put things back together with gold and it highlights the cracks. And it's like,
oh, wow.
What if I don't want to look like that? What if I don't want to be that shape anymore? Even though it's pretty and I put it back together, it's like, so that's something that I've been sitting with. Even when I read this morning, I was like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, exactly. It is like taking that alabaster jar and then making something totally different out of it. Right. Exactly.
And the jar doesn't matter. It's kind of what you used, what was inside of it. That's what matters. But we're all looking at the jar.
Well, this really resonated with me because this was exactly the time when I decided I could no longer be a Catholic. I just couldn't do it anymore. It was all these things that were happening, and so.
Carol, you bring up a great point, and unless somebody has something else to say at home, I want to hear from those, which is a lot of you, if not all of you, who are coming from a different faith tradition, and what was the I know this doesn't really have to do with the top of the book, but just as a way to get to know each other or get to know each other first time. Those that came or are coming from a different faith tradition, what was the proverbial breaking of the alabaster jar cracked open for you that spurred you to a change? Am I the only cradle Episcopalian here?
No, I am too.
Okay, Carolyn. Yep, and Karen.
Leslie.
Oh, and Leslie, right. Leslie took a detour for a little while, right? Go ahead, Leslie.
Yeah, I was Episcopalian years ago, and what really triggered us this time was the inclusion issue. The church we were going to had, anyway, they did not accept LGBTQ people. The Black Lives Matter also hit at that time. We had an issue, our pastor who we loved, left because of some major problems with he was very serious into the LGBTQ inclusion ideas, and he just realized that his church wasn't following with him, and he had to step down. And it was very, very difficult for him, and he and his wife are still having struggles. But the thing is David and I had already made a decision probably a year or two before that we were going to leave the church we were at. We stayed there primarily for them. They became some of our best friends the last couple years before 2020. And we just, when they walked out of the church, we did too. We didn't go back. We have not been back since. But the biggest part that I thought in the book and I don't want to take too long, but is the idea of being in the wilderness. We were in the wilderness probably for several years trying to find a place. There's not a whole lot of places in Kankakee County that are very into inclusion. There were a couple churches, but we just weren't interested in them. And so I said, let's look at Episcopal churches because a lot of them are inclusive. So we looked around and I saw the church in New Lenox. And David's not necessarily 100% Episcopalian, and I understand that. He grew up in the Nazarene church, and he's always been in the Nazarene church. He's never had that option to change, and never had that desire to change necessarily until the last few years before 2020. So I said, okay, let's try Episcopal church because that's what I knew. And I had been there, and I'm kind of gone, and I've gone from Episcopal to very, very conservative to the point where, you know, almost to the point of being, I don't know how what I want, but anyway, very conservative. Then I came back around and realized that those things didn't work for me. I didn't feel comfortable. I never really 100% felt comfortable in there. I couldn't be one to raise my hands and praise the Lord in church. That those were things that I just couldn't do. It was my, I guess my Episcopal background pulled me down a little bit from that. But the only thing I said is that being out in the wilderness, and we were there. And then sometimes I feel like we have found a community, but there are still some times that I miss some of my friends. I feel lost in a way. Part of the problem, New Lenox is 45 minutes away, so we don't always come. Today we're going to be on adult forum for an hour rather than come to church, but we will be hopefully next week. But anyway, I'm going to let somebody else talk, but that's that's why I came. That's why David and I, well, David had a little bit different story, but why we came and what we thought that we wanted some more community, something that was more inclusive. And the only negative thing I see here is that we don't have a multiracial church. And didn't realize when we moved to when we started going to New Lenox that we were going to a white community. And that was something that got us a little bit, oh, okay. But, you know, I know people are working towards trying to be inclusive with them. It's hard. The Episcopal Church has many, you know, African Americans in it. It's just New Lenox is not an African American community, and so you get what the people are comfortable going to. And so anyway, whoever wants to go next, I don't care, but I just wanted you to know where I came from, and welcome, Terry.
Great. And Eleanor. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you for saying that. I could chat a little bit if you want.
Yeah, please do.
A little bit of background. Though I will apologize. I tend to ramble either way, and I'm more eloquent when I'm writing things out. So I will try to be a little more concise. I grew up in a Baptist background, primarily Southern Baptist, and then a little bit of Independent Baptist. I don't have a clear, like, this was a crystallizing moment where it didn't work for me, because in a lot of ways I never quite fit. And my parents were always kind of brushing up against the edges of the conservative traditions there too. I mean, my mom's a nurse and was always in a union, and my dad was very blue collar and in unions. And when I was little, that was less of an issue. And as we got older, like, the clearest picture for me was probably around the time Obama was elected, and we started getting emails from the church about how he was the Antichrist, as an example. When the church just so clearly started to identify itself with, like, the Fox News crowd, and there wasn't a lot of room for conversation otherwise, I got more and more increasingly uncomfortable. And still kind of tried to fight the good fight and stick it out and do what I could. I mean, I won't give you my resume, but I've always been promoted to leadership positions in work and things like that, and was not open or welcome to them in church. So, like, the idea that women can't have those roles never sat right with me. So it was a lot of things like that. I'd almost say for that tradition, it was kind of death by paper cut. For me, the events that the book's talking about were more about how I came back, probably. We lost my grandfather to COVID in 2020. And I saw a lot of people that they went to church with, and even in my family, posting things like, you know, God will protect them. They don't need to wear masks, like, because they're good Christian people. God will take care of them. which, fosters a lot of anger when my grandfather was also a good Christian man who, viruses don't really care about that, as it turns out. So I don't know, but just going through all of that, losing him and funerals and reflecting, I think that's probably cliche, right? But you start to think about things again and started to be drawn back towards church things. And I've done a lot of reading and studying and listening to a lot of podcasts and things like that, trying to figure out, is there something more than what I grew up with? And it sure feels like there is. And I found a lot of the readings and online communities and podcasts and things I were listening to, people were saying over and over again that they were Episcopalian. And so here I am. So I've been watching Grace Online for a little while. And then I've been 4 or 5 times now, I think. So I am liking what I see so far. I enjoyed the first part of the book so far, so I'm interested. Thank you for welcoming me, because I don't know how much I'll have to contribute on this, reflection on what the church is, because I'm still trying to figure that out. But I am enjoying. I like to read, I like to learn, and I like to hear from people. So thank you.
Oh, we're so glad to have you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, welcome.
Any others want to share your breaking of an alabaster jar to get you to change churches? Doesn't have to mean that coming here was the end of your journey. You made it, survived, because what's Terry, I guess in your defense, you're entering into a church here that is what do I want to say? We are connected. You'll hear some of this in the sermon today, but we are spiritually and somewhat nationalistically connected to the Church of England. And so the last few days, there is a lot of ritual and ceremony and tradition happening. And I think it's just one of these little nudges from the Holy Spirit. As we read this book, especially these chapters, we're being confronted with the real white, colonialistic, imperialistic. Every time she said empire, I was like, wow. Thanks, God. Good connection there today. And just how we kind of contend with that. I'm a firm believer of, you can't change an institution from the outside screaming at it. You have to kind of be a part of it. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing, I think. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to name that there and saying it's actually a great time for people to come to this church, because we could use outside opinion and influence. And yes, we pray and pray and pray that this area will become more racially diverse. But until then, we just have to work on ourselves and be ready and welcoming for when that does happen. It will happen.
When you say that the Episcopal Church is open, that was one thing that really surprised me. It's like, ask questions, push back. And I grew up Catholic, and it was like, there was no changing the game from the inside. It was like, there was like, well, can I live with this? No, like not anymore. Right. And I did kind of come to the Episcopal Church. I went down my spiritual path took me very away from Christianity, which I'm very content with. And I came to Grace to check the box on Christmas and Easter with my husband and my kids. And it was like, it's like being called, like, I hate that. That makes me so uncomfortable. Yep. But it's like, there was something here that I was not expecting. And I didn't come here because I was looking for God anywhere else than where I found him already. But it was like, I'm here, and what I had found here, it was like, I guess this, was part of what I was looking for, where you can talk about it and you can affect change in the world. And there's other, people who want to too. And if you have a different opinion, they're like, oh, sorry, you're going to hell. Like that. It doesn't happen here. And it's just, it was what a lovely, lovely surprise.
Wow. Always good to get a little holy surprise, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Greg, I was just thinking I really appreciated the extended analogy in the introduction about the broken alabaster bottle. And one quote from the book has really spoken to my experience and for my hope, I guess. Anyway, she talks about so much is cracked open. We have been cracked open. We don't know how to embrace the disruption, make the sacrifice, stop worshiping the beauty of the jar, and instead break it open so the healing substance inside can work its way into a world that so desperately needs it. We're tempted to scramble around and gather the pieces and reassemble the jar and scoop up the lost oil. And we're really terrified we might be the jar, broken open by God for love of the world. Maybe that's what God wants, but it's not what most American church folks signed on for. And I just think that speaks to my experience. It speaks to what Carolyn and some others have spoken about, the fact that we need to be careful. Yeah, that's what provoked me to make a change. I didn't appreciate the particular bottle, and I think we need to be careful that the alabaster jar, the bottle, is not what we're all about, but the fact that it's the oil within being willing to be broken. And it's an investment that's really hard to make, because it's a lot bigger investment than just going to church and fitting in with a particular sociological group that church represents.
Right.
And yeah, so.
Beautiful. The question that that just came to mind, David, and I mean, really for everybody, those of you that have, say, grown up in either this church or maybe Catholic church, or some kind of predominantly white, at least in America, church, how does this feel for you reading this? We've kind of gotten a habit of hearing things like white privilege and and then also the inequities of COVID, and how we've got to kind of figure out how the church goes forward from here. Obviously, we're experiencing a direct result of COVID right now, which is that we can do these hybrid kind of what I want to say, Zoom meetings, classes, things like that. But I suspect that the disruption and decline that she's going to be talking about more has to do with race, and kind of our reckoning with that. So those that grew up in the church like me, but I won't talk because I'm talking too much. Tell me what you feel when you hear these, this is now crystallized, kind of the last 2.5 years of this reckoning. How does it make you feel? What are your thoughts?
Why are we saying that it's the last 2.5 years? For God's sake, this is too little, too late.
Say more. Say more.
You talked about Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. Well, hello, let's go back years and years and years to Michael Brown and
Emmett Till.
Emmett Till.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, that is what I thought when I read the book, and I read it last year, that it's too little, too late. But I also have to say, she did a pretty good job of the whole question of the complicity of the church in racial issues and white supremacy. But what the hell took us so long? Why the church, not even Stephanie Spellers, but why did it take the church so long to say, oh, this is a problem, And that is what frustrates the heck out of me, is that we just scoot along and go along until something really horrendous happens. And then all of a sudden it's a problem. And like Carolyn said, possibly now that we've addressed the problem, we can check that box and go back to the way we were. And that's, I mean, I'm really happy that we're talking about this, but I just feel like it's about 50 years too late or more, but let's don't go way back. So I see David has his hand up.
David, go ahead.
I agree with you, Karen, but I think the fact of the matter is we saw someone killed on TV. Yeah. And the fact is you can overlook a lot of things, and a lot of things aren't brought to your mind. But when something so traumatic and dramatic like that happens, when you see a man begging for his life and he's killed on TV, that draws your attention, and then you begin to research and look, and you see that, oh, we were very comfortable, but we were comfortable because our whole society is designed to make us comfortable at the expense of others. And so
well, I mean,
happened,
we saw people fire hosed on the Edmund Pettus Bridge 50 years ago, 60 years ago on television, and it didn't move us. And I don't mean us, because I do know that that was an entirely different time, but it didn't move the church. The people who, in the culture, in my opinion, who should be the gatekeepers for how do we, the life of Jesus, right? You know, what would Jesus say about that? We're way too late. So
we're worshiping the jar. Yeah, that's what we're doing.
And it's really easy as Episcopalians to worship the jar, because the jar is so beautiful,
right?
Gorgeous, and it's beautiful music, and it's lovely incense, and it's all of those things. And I grew up in a super low church. I didn't even know that he was a priest. I thought that was just the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. His name was Mister, and he didn't wear vestments. And we had communion once a month, and I didn't even really understand what it was. Even after, confirmation, I didn't get it, because none of that was ever talked about. And then you go past that broad church I come to Chicago, and it's super high church. And now I'm even more in love with the Episcopal Church, because it's much more beautiful than I knew. And still, nothing comes from the pulpit. Nothing happens anywhere except maybe you put money in your little UNICEF jar, which I also did not understand what that was. Nothing comes from the pulpit that's about the world. So beautiful sermons. And I went to a lot of Episcopal churches during those early days of my life because of traveling, and never. So the church to me was a place that didn't talk about politics, that didn't talk about race, that didn't talk about what was happening out on the street. And if you could possibly figure out how to take the things that you learned about Jesus and about what you should be doing and actually apply it to your own life, it was just, like a gift. So I think there's been a huge change, though not where Karen wants it to be yet. But to me, in the Episcopal Church, there's been a huge change. Hey, we could even say, Terry, in the Baptist Church, there's been a huge change, because 20, 30, and 40 years ago, there wasn't a bunch of political talking. I'm not saying I want to go the direction that they are, but at least people are talking about it. It might not be my opinions, but I'd rather see talking than none.
The one thing I thought about when I started reading this book is that this book is written by a Black woman. It needs to be a white person that's screaming this. She is just saying what Black people have been saying for years. And nobody listens to the Black people because they're Black people, and I totally agree with everything.
So you're saying we need more advocacy from white people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or maybe we need to be quiet and listen for a while.
Exactly.
And not lead. Maybe we need to let people that have experienced it from minority groups speak to us and tell us the world from their viewpoint, instead of trying to make them fit into our viewpoint. Maybe we need to learn for a while. But I think your point is good, Carol. I think Carol, your point is good, that you point out it's important who these words are coming from, and that we need to be supporters and allies right now. I think we need to take a look at womanist theologians. Those are primarily, if you don't know what they are, they're women Black women theologians that are telling things from a Black woman's perspective, and other minorities, Hispanic theologians. We need to take these people into account. They'll so much enrich our experience, and they'll show us how parochial we've become and where our beliefs are coming from, basically from white patriarchy. And but anyway, that's my view. I've been on my soapbox long enough. So
yeah, well, I think American Christianity is like American politics. It's run by old men, white men, and they're, you know, they do a great job brainwashing us when we're kids.
So there's that continuum of like trying to meet people where they are, so they're not like, I'm not reading a book written by a Black woman. So you kind of like but then if they read something that maybe opens their heart to, they would read a book by a Black, you know what I mean? It's like that, but then you feel like you're sort of betraying your values if you back it off a little bit. It's an uncomfortable place to be.
I attended one of the diocesan anti-racism workshops several years ago, and a question was posed to the group, and the group was a mixed group, Black and white. Just the simple question, how often do you think about, oh, I'm white, I'm this, it's like, we've never been challenged to consider what our whiteness is. And yet the Black people that were in the group, their comments were, there's not a day of my life, not a moment of my life that I am not challenged from outside to know that I'm Black and that I am in my place. And, just that, and so I know a lot of white people are very uncomfortable. This whole issue of white privilege and white supremacy. If you've never really had to think about it, then yes, it can be very uncomfortable, as well it should. And I think this book is kind of uncomfortable, as well it should. We all need to be thinking about that and how we live out our own lives. And what do we take away from church and go out into the world to maybe make our own little minor changes that can all add up and help? The fact that Grace is situated in a predominantly white community anyway, we shouldn't feel guilty about that. We shouldn't feel guilty about the fact that our congregation is composed of certain types of people. But still, it's out there, and we need to be thinking about it. And I think it really comes down to individual responsibility. When we come together and worship as a community, and we learn and grow, it really comes down to the individual level. So what am I challenged to do in the way I live out my life? And how does church facilitate that?
I was told challenging was okay, so I hope this isn't too aggressive. But the one thing, so I grew up in Lockport, and I live in Lockport now, but very close to New Lenox. So we're right off of Cowger Road. I grew up in Lockport, probably 3 miles from my house right now, which is a very different house in a very different neighborhood. But Grace is 3, 4, 5 miles from communities that are predominantly Hispanic and predominantly Black. People are not far away, even though the neighborhoods here are very segregated. So like, I think there are people that outreach could be done. There are places that it could happen, but there's so much structurally about society that makes it hard for that to happen. I recognize that, but it's not like we're in the middle of Iowa and literally there are very few minorities here. That's not the case at all. They're here and they're not that far away. They're really not.
So in addition to the Pride Parade, we need to be out involved in as individuals as well as representing Grace. I mean, like a big sign at a table. We need to be out in some of the local neighborhood parties and festivals and etc., because people have met us and come to Grace because of meeting us at the Pride Parade. So why aren't we doing the same thing in some of these other communities? There's something going on. There may be some church that, we talked about this once before, a church that we could partner with. Or, I mean, that's how people get to grace, is by listening to podcasts, and it's all Episcopalians saying what you want to hear, and meeting Greg and meeting each of us when we've got a big sign on our chest that says we're from Grace.
Yeah. Little old-fashioned evangelism.
Yes, not the totally old-fashioned one where you go to people's doors.
Yeah,
I'm an Episcopalian. We don't do that. So, but the neighborhood evangelizing, I could do that.
Right.
And I would just add, we need to realize, no, there's no blame on us that we go to a church that's in a white community. We need to realize there's a reason why this community is all white. And we need to address those things along with what Carolyn's saying. We need to address those things. We need to understand that there are societal influences, local and statewide and going on. There's reasons why the areas in the Chicagoland area are as racially distinct as pretty much anywhere in the United States. Chicago is famous for having, highly polarized neighborhoods. And there's reasons for that, because racism, although it's not as blatant, it's not as in your face, it's just as prevalent systemically as it is anywhere in the United States.
That's right. Others, maybe anyone we haven't heard from, want to offer any comments, feedback? No pressure. It is early on a Sunday. Welcome, Brendan.
Hi.
Slipped in late. Yeah.
Since we're still kind of talking about overarching or overview issues, it has really struck me in these past couple of days what's going on in England right now. There is a lot of commentary about the historical relationship of the monarchy and colonialism and imperialism and racism. It's all very racist based, and calls for the monarchy to be reformed or even eliminated. She's not talking about the church being eliminated, but it's kind of the same issues.
Oh, yes, definitely tied in.
Different institutions, but real similar issues that need to be addressed and reformed, almost like a second Reformation in terms of the church. And in terms of the monarchy, who knows where that's going to go, and what can be done to help heal that colonial racist past.
Right.
So that it's not just always hovering over that particular society.
Yeah. You can absorb just fine. Absolutely.
I was just
Go ahead, Leslie.
I was just thinking a little bit about the colonialism and all of what was going on in England. And it makes it very difficult sometimes to realize that it's only been 200 years since we were part of that same colonial situation, and our church came out of that. And so we're still kind of part of the problem more than some other churches, And I read somewhere the other day, I'm reading 3 books right now. So 3 different books for 3 different reading groups. And the one book that I'm reading is by Brian McLaren, and it's about, should I stay Christian or not? And the first half of the book is all about why not to do it. And that's where I just finished that part, which that's what we're going to discuss tonight on Zoom or whatever they do. And then the second part is yes, there's 10 chapters on why, yes, we need to stay as a Christian. And then the third part is how to do that. So anyway, but the old part is all about the patriarchy and all about non-inclusiveness, why people, one of the things that was stated was, and I don't remember now which book it was in, but I can find more inclusiveness as being a non-Christian, being at my workplace, being in my community, than I can be in the church. And so why go to the church to get that instead of going back? Why be in, I have what I really want out here in the community. I have inclusiveness. I have, fellowship with my own community, and the church is one community, and it's a different type of community than what you find out in I don't want to say secular world, but out in the world. So that's what really got me, was this whole idea of that a lot of people are leaving the church or doing away with the church, and they don't, is because of the old-fashioned way that it's been run, and it needs to be re-evaluated as what is our purpose? Is our purpose to go back to the church, be where we were, or go back to the church and utilize some of the things that we're going to learn, hopefully in the next few weeks, from some of these books that my husband and I have been reading? Or do we stay where we are and be centered on ourselves rather than centered on the outside world? And that's what happens. But anyway, that I was just thinking about that. That was just how, the churches can be part of the problem, and we have to be sure that we're not going back to where we started, and we're 2 years out of 2 years in from a pandemic. People are still getting sick, and not as many people are dying, but they're still getting sick. We're still having to deal with that, and we need to be diligent. David's mother just got over COVID, and you worry about a 92 or 3-year-old person getting it, because they have other issues in their lives too, medical issues, and you don't know how it's going to respond. She did well with it, but some people don't. And I'm sorry about your grandfather, Terry. So.
Not 92 for nothing.
That's right. One of the things you're describing, Leslie, in the book is what Stephanie calls inertia. Well, she didn't call it, physics calls it inertia, but she applies the term to it, and that feeling that, just we're sometimes by our nature just resistant to move and change. And it's hard to get momentum going. And I think you see it in, well, to start, let's just talk about the pandemic and just say, how often, and I'm very guilty of it. Guilty is not the right word, but I'm emblematic of it, of saying, when we get back to normal, when we get back to the way it was, when we're, get past it. And I think that kind of phraseology, even for COVID, can be applied to how we treat, all the other injustices, which is just, she talks about, you see, something breaks, you want to tape it back together the way it was, instead of, as we talked about at the very beginning, kind of creating a new thing with, the broken pieces.
One of the things that kind of makes me feel the same way is when you have a disease or something that debilitates you, and you think, okay, I'm going to get through this, and then I'm going to go back to normal, but my normal's not where it was before. Right. I'm all of a sudden, I'm using a cane versus walking free, but that's my normal now. And I have to adjust to that. And it's not always the easiest thing to adjust for a lot of people. I did fine, but some people don't. They don't want to do that. So it's just like any kind of and I don't want to say this is a disease, but it is a disease in our churches where we go back to our normal, and it's a disease that we need to move forward and accept the new way. Maybe more people needed to be wearing masks, or we need to do things that are reaching out to everybody rather than just to our local group.
And if your church is your anchor, like you grow up and it's this solid touchstone place that never changes, and it's like something you can always go back to. And when that starts to change, and it needs to change, it's pretty destabilizing for the church itself and the people who, it's like, it's like trying to hang on to something that's moving now instead of something that's solid. And it doesn't mean it shouldn't happen, because it should happen, but it's not everybody's willing to.
This whole thing with cracking the church open it's historically not what the church has pushed, because the church historically has made people feel like they can accept what the God has given them rather than change it. They're afraid of change. Normal is better. They can't see that change may be better if they just open their mind to it.
Maybe it's more about power than about God.
Right, exactly.
Right.
It's really interesting, because having lived through the transition period after Vatican II, for a lot of Roman Catholics, that was an extremely destabilizing thing. We have a friend who was for a time at St. Benedict's Monastery, and he talked about how about 75% of the monks in that community ended up leaving. The changes were so huge and so abrupt that it was just really hard for them to deal with it. And I think, people on the parish level felt that way also. So, and along with that, I think the changes that were imposed, basically changing the liturgy to be in the vernacular and all that, I don't think that was all that John the 23rd wanted. I really think he was talking more about the church's role and all that. And I don't really think the Roman church has really addressed those issues. They now just have those issues in English. Or German, or Polish, wherever the church is.
Italian.
15 years ago, they reworked all this stuff, and there were all these big changes coming, and it was like, all right, great. And then they changed like 7 words, but addressed nothing that was really a problem for anybody. It's like, oh, so now we say him instead of our. I mean, some made it worse. It was like, what are you doing? That took 15 years.
Well, and a lot of the old people in the Catholic Church were against putting the Mass in English. It's like, okay, you want to not know what they're saying up there. You just want to babble away these.
They still exist. There's a whole trad Catholic movement that is
to go back to Roman,
to go back to Latin, to have it'd be super high church with smells and bells and everything, and to make it more esoteric than it is now. And I just think, how is that, like, if that works for you, great. Like, if that's what's meaningful to you, great, but that's not the church working in the world.
Right.
There's a Roman Catholic parish in Oak Park, which is strictly all Latin Mass.
There you go.
And obviously, it's not just geographically based like most parishes. If you live in this parish, that's where you have to go to church. At least that's how it was when we were growing up.
Oh yeah, exactly.
But I mean, that church in Oak Park draws people from all over the place, just because some kind of way, going back to the way things were before, this golden era that really never existed, is going to somehow make things better.
Greg, it may not be completely, I think most of it is, but it may not be completely about going back to the wonderful, golden era. For me, I'd rather have it be in Latin because of the beauty. So it's all about beauty to me, but I have to know what they're saying. So I'm going to look up every single word so that I know all this stuff. That is honestly one of the reasons I'm interested in singing, because so many, particularly classical and sacred pieces, are in Latin or Italian, and it challenges me to learn, because you can't sing intelligently without knowing what you're saying, or else you can't put the right emotion into the singing. So I love that, but I wouldn't want to not know what I was saying.
Yeah.
Immersing
Might be
yourself
some
in
of that.
the part of it is-
I don't see why we can't have both.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is, all religions, they all have their equivalent of the Latin Mass. They all have a certain way of worshiping that you're comfortable with. It brings you comfort. But then we get into the issue of what is worship really about? Is it for our own comfort primarily? Or should it be directed towards God, directed towards inclusion of others? It's a complex situation, because I'll tell you what, in the church, the best way to get for the pastor to get removed is to go in there and make 3 changes in terms of worship service and stuff like that. Let's do a whole new worship style and stuff like that. Well, then he's on his way, you know. You know.
All you have to do is put a flag or take a flag away in the sanctuary, and just saying.
Right? Debbie or Diane, I just want to make sure you have a chance to, if you've got any thoughts or reactions or anything. You don't have
No.
to. No, good.
I'll wait.
Fantastic. Folks, I'm not here next week. Charity will get you set up on the Zoom and the OWL. But, you know, go easy if there's any technical problems. At the end of the day, someone can always turn on their phone and just prop it up, you know, if you're having trouble. But please continue without me. If there's a volunteer, if not, I'll ask somebody during the week. Somebody could open with prayer, and maybe someone else could be mindful of just making sure everyone gets a chance to talk at least. It would be awesome. And then I'll see you the next week. So next week will be chapter 2. And then we'll go from there.
We won't be here in 2 weeks.
Okay. Take care, and thank you, everybody. Welcome again, Terry, and see you all for worship soon somehow. Bye.